What's up everyone, it's Bones here. In today's video, I'll be covering a tier list. Now that we've had some recent events like the recent YCSs and this past weekend's WCQs, to give us some info about all the decks that are out right now. But before I begin, if you happen to enjoy content like this, clicking those thumbs up and subscribe buttons would be greatly appreciated, as it goes a long way in supporting the channel and shows me that you like content like this. So to begin, you'll see that we have the motherload of decks here. There's actually a total of 60 of them, and we'll be going one by one, starting with Eldlish. And Eldlish I'm going to put at the back end of 1.5. This one could count as branded Eldlish and the trap version of the deck, just because both decks are really annoying to play against. You can get floodgated out of the game easily, and Eldlish is just one of those decks that, with the combination of strong floodgates and a trap engine that has a strong backbone, with the ability to even play mine in the main deck in decks that go well over 40, along with the tops that it has happened to get, definitely makes this no lower than 1.5 in my opinion, but I do think that it's closer to the back end. The next deck is Invoked, Branded, Dogmatic, and all that stuff. I know that there's an Eldlish variant also, and I want to put it at 2, maybe like the higher end. I don't necessarily think the deck is as explosive as some of the other ones, but it's consistent and it has access to a lot of strong monsters, so it's not always going to be an easy deck to beat. Along with the ability to main a fair amount of hand traps, or just play the Eldlish engine along with the branded and invoke stuff, is enough to make this deck tier 2. And I haven't even discussed the Shaddoll variant, which I'll get to later. The next deck on the list is Dark Magicians, and quite frankly, this is in the cope section. So Dark Magicians haven't gotten enough good support over time. I mean, we've gotten Illusion of Chaos, but Verte was just banned, which kind of hurt its easy access to Dragoon. It still has ways to do it, but it's just not the same without Verte. That being said, having 3 skill drain is definitely a plus for the deck, and if you want to try something fun because you happen to like the deck, it's a deck that you can still use. It's just the rest of what's up here is on a different scale of power. But that's not to say that the deck doesn't function, and the deck can definitely steal you some games. The next deck / engine is going to be Adventure, and I'm going to get this out of the way now. Adventure Punks and the Therions. Let me look for Regulus here. I should have a picture of him. So Adventure Punk Therion, the deck, or Punk Therion, Adventure Punk, I think that this stuff is tier 1. I've been saying it since the start of the format. When you have an engine that can mill 8, add 1, or just flat out mill 9, and then have 2 different engines that you can play to protect your lines of play, can make this deck quite crazy. And on top of that, just the splash ability of them to be able to go into different decks. Like, you have Sunvalons, which I'll speak about later, that have the ability to play these 2 engines here. And then there's other decks like Phantom Knights, which I'll also go over later, that are just happening to play the Adventure and Punk engines. It's hard not to put this at tier 1 with just how littered they are in the format. Of course, I'm not counting them as decks of their own. I think if we were talking about Adventure Punk and Therions on their own, they'd obviously be a bit lower, but talking about them as engines, I'm going to put them up here, as well as talking about them as a combination. The next deck on the list is Dinos, and Dinos has taken an interesting turn because Dinos isn't necessarily the Dinos we once knew. So recently we've been seeing a lot of the Bishbalkan FTK pop up, not just in events, but online in both Master Duels and even in some mid to low rated parts of Dueling Book. If you're unprepared or you just happen to not draw any hand traps at all, the deck definitely just wins. But it's not enough to put it over Rogue for me, as if you are prepared and you know the choke points, it's really not that terrible of a deck to deal with, as there are some interactions that can put the entire combo to rest. That being said, its ability to play a different game than the FTK with its utility of the Dino cards are enough to make it Rogue and not Cope for me. The next deck on the list is a deck that we've actually been seeing a fair amount of representation for what some may have expected heading into this format, and that's Synchrons. We've seen a couple of these lists make day 2 of pretty big events, and we even saw one of these lists have an amazing day 1 at Hartford. I think that they were like 8-1. So I think that Synchrons are definitely a deck to not ignore, as players are figuring out more ways to play around hand traps with the deck through stuff like Chaos Ruler and just having the Baron or early Crystal Link plays that you can make in order to make sure that you don't lose to it. The next deck on the list is Dinomorphia, and this is another Rogue deck. I can't put it at tier 2 because despite its tenacity with the ability to set 5, Rex Turn being such a powerful card that locks your opponent out of activating monster effects if you have lower life points than them, which I believe it is. And not only that, but on top of that, it can change your opponent's monsters to the amount of life points you have, which you get low amount of life points with this deck pretty quickly. But with that being said, with everything this deck still has going for it, D-barriers in the format, Super Poly is kind of in and out of the format right now. Some people are still playing it, but even Despia players themselves are choosing to start siding it because too many decks are in the format, as you can see here. And while that side of it may bode well for Dinomorphia in the future, right now I just think that it's a nice Rogue pick that is something not to be taken lightly, really. The next deck, and I also have to put it here at Rogue, I'm going with Pendulums, and the reason I'm going with this deck at Rogue is because the deck still has its issues going second, but on top of that, it seems like what it does going first, other decks that mix these 3 top engines just seem to be doing better, which is the Dagda, Scythe, Lock, along with the Hulk. While it's not a deck to sleep on, Anti-Spell and D-Barrier existing, along with Sword Soul, can make things very difficult for this deck to compete on a higher level consistently. That being said, there are some pilots that may able to do well with the deck because it has power, and it's not a bad deck by any stretch, but I just don't think that it's as good as the ones above it. The next deck, and I'm sad that I have to put this here, is Mechanized. So Mechanites have gotten Gearsu, but that's pretty much it. We haven't had an expansion of going second cards since we got like Lightning Storm, Droplet, Dark Ruler. We got an influx of those type of cards, and for a short while we've stopped. And because the decks are evolving and cards like Droplet aren't as crazy, don't get me wrong, it's still good, but it's not as crazy as it once was, as well as Dark Ruler and stuff like that. I feel like it also makes Mechanites weaker. Not to say that it's necessarily a weak deck, because even if you're on the Cope section as a deck, I do believe that the decks aren't bad themselves. It's just not something that you should expect to see a moderate level of success with. And that brings me to my next one, and I really hope this deck gets more support. That's Necros. I personally played this deck way back in DUEA. It was my favorite deck of the format by far, next to Zombies, which is another deck I played just forever. I think I've probably played Zombies since like 2005, even though with some of the more recent archetypes, how much I've played Zombies has gone down. But Necros has to be put in this cope section because it came out at a time where the extra deck was more prominent. There wasn't as much variety as there is now. And locking down the extra deck back then with Unicore was just stronger than it is now, especially because now we have cards like Lightning Storm, Droplet, Dark Ruler, and all this stuff. So, while there are iterations of the deck that can do well with the Dogmatica stuff, which Nadir Servant is also a 2 now, Diviner is nice, and stuff like that, I just don't think that it has enough versatility through different matchups to put it anywhere past Cope. And another Cope deck, sadly, I mean, unless you're Lithium. Lithium makes this deck like tier 2, tier 1.5. But Monarchs themselves, I'd put at right around Cope because, again, you're playing a lot of bricks. And if you're playing the Domain Monarch deck, you're also risking the fact that you won't have an extra deck. You're basically Majesty's Fiend and Vanity's Fiend plus Domain or Bust, and I just don't think that's a viable strategy in a format like this, and especially when you want your deck to be able to go second consistently, I just don't see Monarchs as one of those type of decks. The next deck here is Altergeist, and I have to put them at Rogue, just because I don't think that they're necessarily dead, with Skill Drain and Protocol being a thing in which you can continue to use your Altergeist while Skill Drain is on the field. I think that there's potential for some sneaky tops and regionals and stuff like that, and Lord of the Heavenly Prison being able to protect your back row and even being able to search your spoofing. I don't necessarily think that it's a deck that should be entirely slept on, but it's definitely not as good as it once was. Magical Musketeers are a deck that I would like to put in Rogue because the thing is that good players will often pilot this deck randomly in the middle of formats just because a lot of people don't know how to play against it. And the minute that Max comes out and spams the board, it can quickly be game over. The ability to have a bunch of cards that you can also activate from the hand on your opponent's turn while controlling a magical musket can also be really good. But if we're talking about the deck itself and not piloted by some of the top players in the game, I do think that you have to put it at Cope because while Chaos Max can rapidly speed this deck up, a lot of the times you're still banking on it to resolve, and you still have to see your musket monsters. The next deck on the list is Cyber Dragons, and sadly this is another deck on the Cope list. I know that it just got Therions and whatnot, but the problem is that without Verte, it doesn't have access to some of the stronger plays that it had before. The Therion engine can be kind of bricky if you don't open right, and it just doesn't feel like there's a version of this right now that feels correct to play, because with how much back row removal there is right now due to mine, even the trap version of this deck seems a bit vulnerable right now. The next deck is Marine Cess, and I don't know if I'm going to get hate for this, but I'm putting this at 1.5. And I'm putting this at 1.5 because it's one of those decks that it just needs one card. It can play a bunch of hand traps. It can play a lot of anti-meta-like cards. And on top of that, set up a Towers-like monster if you can make it unaffected with the field spell and Crystal Heart. Or you can get the Link 4 that's sort of like Heat Soul. Basically banish a water, draw one during each standby phase. And the ability to make Toad for really committing to your plays as well make this deck hard to deal with. So definitely not a deck I think you should sleep on. The next deck is Plunder Patrol, and I'm kind of surprised to see how underwhelming this has been. I know that during the WCQ, I believe it was, I don't know if it was Italy's or Germany's minis. But we happen to see someone cosplaying as a pirate and playing the Plunder deck. I do think that it's at the back end of tier 2. I think that you could have made an argument at the end of last format that this could have been at the bottom of tier 1.5, but I just think that the steep drop-off in representation says a lot for itself, but it's still not a deck to sleep on either. Just the fact that you can set up the adventure engine, have the fateful discard go to the Plunder that special summons the Raven from deck. You can definitely do some very powerful things with this deck. But I believe that you have to put a lot of the other tier 2 decks above it, as well as, of course, what's in 1.5 and 1. So unfortunately, I have to put Orcust here at Cope. And there's a few versions of it that you can play, the rockets, the Predaplant stuff. There's some engines that you can throw in to this deck to make it somewhat serviceable to today's format. But with that being said, you're still playing a bunch of bricks and you're playing a bunch of cards that may not necessarily work together in one hand if you happen to draw kind of awkward. Without Harp Horror, the deck also doesn't quite feel as strong enough to really put it where the decks above it are. So this is another one that I might get hate for, and I'm going to put at Ignister also at 1.5. And this is another deck that simply can just play a bunch of hand traps. It can play Mystic Mine, sit on a 6k unaffected monster while locking you out of the game somewhat with Mine. Right now, at Ignister is kind of a scary deck, and if you're not prepared for this, you're going to lose to it. Then there's Trap Tricks. I think I kind of also have to put Trap Tricks as Cope. And the reason is this deck just can't go second. It relies too much on the whole cards. And while going first, it can be really annoying. The TCG, unlike Master Duels, is a best 2 out of 3. So I don't necessarily think a deck like this can thrive this format. Then there's the Evil Twins / Live Twins. And I almost want to put this at the back end of tier 2. But I'm going to put them near the top of Rogue, and it's simply because Trouble Sunny is extremely weak to Bell and Called by the Grave. Being able to play the multitude of hand traps and going second stuff is nice, but if you don't have a boss monster that can make its presence truly felt consistently the way Marine Cess and Ad Ignister can, I just feel like that consistency and the hand traps and all is dwarfed by the power you need to remain relevant this format. Not a bad deck by any means in my opinion though. Next deck that we have on the list is Infernobles, and I wouldn't sleep on this deck. There's actually a YouTube channel called Team COG. I think he even topped a regional this format with Infernobles, and it's been interesting to see how this deck is adjusting without deck of Phantom Beast Aurora Dawn. Just the fact that we're seeing it go into Hulk and Dagda for the Scythe like a bunch of other decks, but the way that it's also increasing its monster count by using stuff like Doppel Warrior to get more tokens onto the field so it can continue to synchro. This is a deck that if you're not prepared to, you can still very well lose to, and Gearfried is a strong card. Next deck on the list is Tri-Brigade, and unfortunately, I do have to put this at the top of tier 2 rather than 1.5. I know that this thing won a Nationals. I know that it's seen some top cuts throughout this format. But with that being said, I think that those have been times where the deck has been piloted by very good players. And overall, if you're looking to pick this deck up, I just think that it's a little bit too fair compared to the ones above it. But with that being said, the room you have to play hand traps and stuff and Revolt into Omen is still really good. You can still set up your Appaloosa pretty easily. Tenki's back at 2. So not a deck to sleep on, but I just have it at the top of tier 2. The next deck on the list is Sunvine, and this is another tier 2 deck. Quite frankly, I think this deck can be terrifying. Just the fact that it can lock you out of your monster effects if you overcommit, and your opponent flips the trap on you and just negates the monsters that you currently control. If you don't have any other monsters to activate from your hand or graveyard, that could very well be GG, as they're also sitting on the Link 4. They can get access to Regulus, the Adventure Engine, and stuff like that. The only real reason I don't have this deck any higher is because I just think that the other decks above it are more consistent, can match up well or better versus the decks above. Weakness to Nibiru can also be pretty harsh for the deck and its players. If you don't happen to see your Regulus early or your adventure stuff, you're just pretty much vulnerable to it. Next deck on the list, and unfortunately it's another Cope deck, is going to be Trickstars. Trickstars is at an interesting place now where it's getting cards back, Light Stage. It lost Verte though. Scapegoat is back at 3, but haven't seen enough with that. With that being said, Re-Enroll is still a really strong combo, and the room you have to play hand traps, board breakers, and stuff like that is definitely something the deck has going for it, but it's just too slow right now for it to be anywhere above Cope when you look at the strength of the rogue decks here. The next deck on the list, and this is kind of like the first real archetype that we have at tier 1. So, you know that Sword Soul kind of hard loses to Token Collector. They don't go for Baron and they make Sovereign. It becomes insanely weak to Nib. At the same time, I think that you have to respect this deck's consistency, being able to make oppressive boards and then back them up with side cards like Anti-Spell and D-Barrier in games 2 and 3. Make this deck really tough to deal with, especially when you consider how easy it is to make your board. Stuff like the free Moye draw also can just make this deck that much better. As for Earth Machines, I unfortunately do have to put this at Rogue. I do think that it's gotten better, especially with the addition of Regulus. But with that being said, we haven't seen it do a lot. I'm almost inclined to put it below Synchrons because we've actually seen Synchrons do more. It's not to say that Earth Machine is a bad deck. As I said before, the ones above it are just better. So the next deck on the list is Zombies, and I have this as one of my higher end rogue picks. And the reason for this is because of the Adventure and Punk engine. So this is one of those decks that can play both of them, as once you start discarding Mizuki's with this or sending it off the Punk engine with like Foxy Tune, being able to then mill with Chaos Ruler and get zombies in the graveyard can be kind of nuts. Also have multiple ways to Scythe Lock your opponent, as not only do you have the Dagda Elkway, but because of the level 10 Red Eyes Synchro, if you happen to have Zombie World on your side of the field, you can even revive Scythe with the level 10 Synchro if you happen to mill it off Chaos Ruler or Zombie Vampire and don't want to add it back to your hand of the Chaos Ruler. So, because of the bricks, I'm hesitant to put it at tier 2, but I definitely do think that it's at the higher end of Rogue because of its power. Next deck on the list, and we actually saw Farfa top with this recently, is Burning Abyss. I almost want to put this at the lower end of Rogue, just because when you have a deck that can play Floodgates quite easily, easy to cheese out wins like that, and it's something that can be slept on. So, you can argue it's the closer side to Cope, because this thing has a recent top. Even if it is just a regional, I am going to keep this at the bottom end of Rogue. The next deck on the list is Shaddols, and this is basically invoked Shaddols. I think trap Shaddols have just been phased out, aren't good on their own anymore. That being said, I do think that invoked Shaddol Dogmatica is a strong rogue pick. It's not a bad deck, but it's just, I think that the deck is better off with the branded stuff, and even playing the Eldish engine over the Shaddols. You're able to out things like Mine and other stuff. That being said, it's not a deck to sleep on, as Winda can still be really annoying, and Schism and Ariel and Nadir Servant are all really good cards. I think that higher end Rogue is a good place for Shaddols right now. The next deck on the list is Despia, and I almost want to put this at 1.5. Because of how vulnerable it is to certain decks, like 3 next to it, make this deck feel underwhelming at times, but I think that you have to look at the fact that Despia is the type of deck that if people stop maining for this, Despia is going to come back into the format. It's going to feel like it can blow everything out. Power cards like Super Poly or being able to side there can be only one, or the Zombie World package. Its ability to play through hand traps. If Branded Fusion can kind of hard lose to Ash on some hands, I think that you still have to put this at the back end of tier 1, just because it's a format shifter. Format shifts away from Despia. Despia is going to come back in, and when Despia starts coming back in, other decks are going to start countering it, like the ones here at the 1.5. So while it's not the tier 0 people thought it would be, I do still want to leave them here at tier 1 for now. Next deck on the list is Drytrons, and I've seen people putting this at tier 1, and I don't want to go that far. I do understand that going first, they can end on Vanity's Ruler, they can end on the Turn Skipper Ritual if they want to play that, the main phase Skipper to be precise. But that being said, I just don't think that it's as consistent as the top decks. I think that very good at what it does. Mine makes the deck better. You're able to kind of stall and unclog your hands if it comes down to it. It's not a deck that I'm willing to put at 1, just because I think that tier 1 decks are a notch better than it. The next deck is Flunder. I think that this is another 1.5 deck. I think that it has kind of fallen off a little with the arrival of other decks like Marincess and the rise of Adagnister. Zombie World being in the format definitely has been a hit to Flu, but it's still an extremely strong deck that can play all the annoying cards and is very easy to lose to. Next deck on the list is Virtual World, and this is another deck that I think just has fallen into Rogue. One could argue for their ability to be tier 2 with Zaires back at 2 and the fact that it can somewhat play around D-Barrier with the fact that it's Synchros, Exceed, Haste, and you don't necessarily need to commit to one. Just think that some of these other decks outclass it right now as far as their roles in the format go. And not to say that it's a bad deck, but I just think that it's Rogue right now. Their cope deck here is Blue Eyes, and again, I just kind of wish that they would do more for some of these decks here. There used to be a time where if you were down in this section, then it was a chance that your deck couldn't even function. So I will say that I am happy about that. Even if your deck is on the cope section, these are still decks that can function. Blue Eyes can play with the rocket stuff and make some little nice cute boards, but that's about all you're gonna get from that. The next deck on the list is, don't necessarily want to say Talker Heat Soul Control. This can also be the Extra Link deck and whatnot. And again, I think that this is Rogue. I don't necessarily think it's as good as its other Cybers counterparts, because I think Heat Soul is just better than Salamangreat and Adignister, because the archetypes themselves are able to do something more impactful this format. Being said, I don't think it's a bad deck. It can still be very annoying to play against a Heat Soul that can just draw you into a bunch of hand traps. Rogue is where I'll have to leave it for now. Next deck on the list is ABC, and going to put ABC at 1.5. The reason for this is, still you are kind of reliant on Union Hanger / I think the name is Urgent Schedule. I don't remember. The quick play spell that is also a starter for the deck. I can't remember the name of it. I'll post a picture of it throughout the video, but if the deck is fragile, it's terrifyingly strong, and the access to the Therions giving it early protection potentially is also something the deck has going for it, so it's not a deck that I would sleep on at all. Buster at 3, and the ability for the ABC pieces to kind of float and do their thing with Buster also make this deck that much more annoying. Next deck on the list is Phantom Knights, and this is another deck that I just have to put at Rogue. It can still make great turn 1 boards, but I don't necessarily think that out Verte it can consistently compete at the level once side compete, especially without the ability to have Omni Negation consistently to kind of protect your Fog Blades. Stuff like that is what makes me want to put it at Rogue. You're still also playing a lot of Garnets. Again, you are playing a deck with an incredibly high ceiling when it's able to play. Next deck on the list is Elemental Heroes, and I know that this might sound a little bit crazy. I almost want to put it at the back end of Tier 2, and I'm also going to give its counterpart Destiny Heroes. I want to put these two at Tier 2 because not only can they go first with Dark Law and giving the opponent the Dark Angel in order to basically shut them out of the spells they want to play, I just think that more of the recent builds that we've been seeing pick up the Lightning Storms, the Forbidden Droplets, more of these board-breaking cards, be very troublesome for some of the decks that are listed up above. Being said, I do think that they're definitely on the closer spectrum to Rogue. Decks still have their own problems, as first not being able to be as strong as other decks. Still going second, you still kind of have to draw the outs. I do think that there's a conversation for these two being at the back end of Tier 2. But next deck on the list, and I unfortunately have to put it at Cope, Unchained came out at a very weird time. So Unchained plays like a deck that would have been terrifying in UEA or like in 2016. It came out like in 2019, and all these combo decks that have come out and all these one-card starter decks, along with stuff like Sky Strikers, Despia, and some of these other mid-range control decks, just severely outclassed it. And while I think it's a cool deck with cool artwork, has a cool stuff they can do by linking your opponent's monsters off, which is pretty nuts in itself, I just don't think that the deck is good enough to compete with the ones above it to a consistent basis. Next deck on the list is Adamanticators, and again, I think that this can easily be bottom end Rogue, because even if it lost L and it lost Verte, the deck can still make terrifying boards turn 1, and the deck itself, with things like Analyzer, Monster Reborn card, and whatnot, and just maining cards like Forbidden Droplet and Lightning Storm, can help it go second. Honestly, the only reason that this is even at the bottom end of Rogue is because I just think it's like a way better Trap Tricks, in the sense that your turn 1 board is way better. You also have somewhat of a chance to go second with this deck. DDDs, and I think that DDDs are another deck that's in tier 2. Edited by the right player, we've seen that this deck can make top cuts. Mechanized was a great addition to the deck. I think that Griffin was another great addition to the main deck, as now Kepler really is a one-card combo. A Scale 0 and Reiji is also a really good addition to the deck, as being able to pendulum summon the Kepler was one thing that we were missing kind of like forever. Deck also has access to power cards like Ragnarok. It can make strong extra deck monsters like Siegfried. Even play kind of a control style game by ending on something like the Mechanized Siegfried paired with hand traps. Gate and Kepler now being one-card starters definitely made this deck more than the glass cannon that it used to be. Next deck on the list is Sharks, and I'm going to have to put Sharks at the bottom end of Rogue. So my thing with Sharks is that they can make Kraken, they can make a Cook if they want to go that route, and they can sit under Gozen, but while they have all of that going for it, it's just all these other decks really do outclass it in what they can do. Still think it's definitely a fun deck if you want to try something different. Give your opponent fits, because when this deck works, it is very annoying to play against. Next deck on the list, and I've been seeing a lot of people put Dragon Link at tier 1, the Punk Adventure version of it, and I can understand why. When you add the Adventure Punk stuff to it, its matchup against a lot of these decks becomes infinitely better. But my thing with Dragon Link is that just like Despia has a really bad Sword Soul matchup, Dragon Link has a really bad Despia matchup. And unlike Despia, in which they can side in token collectors going second, I don't think that Dragon Link has that going second card that it can just kind of auto-win the matchup with. I mean, you can activate Mine, but that doesn't guarantee much. Other deck that I'm kind of hesitant to put at tier 1, so I'll leave at the top of tier 1.5 because I do still think it's a very strong deck. I just don't want to put it at 1 yet, because I feel like people start to prepare for it a lot more. The Despia matchup becomes significantly worse. Next deck on the list, and Susu actually made top 4 of LGS, the Luxury Game Series tournament with Grand Maju, and Susu is from Head to Head Battles YouTube channel. It's kind of been coming up over the last couple of years. Grand Maju's ability to sack wins out of nowhere and even be able to floodgate your opponent can be strong, but I still do have to put it at Cope, because I feel like the decks above it function better than Grand Maju does. I do think that Grand Maju would need a main deck card or two, whether it be a trap or another spell, to kind of push this back into category. Next deck on the list is Dragoonity. Dragoonity is just one of those other decks that I have to put at Cope, but at the very top of it. Aptrix, it is really predicated on going first, except it's kind of like the combo version of that, which is why it's so much higher. I have access to kind of scary main deck boss monsters, but not necessarily boss monsters that aren't bricks either, which is why it's Cope, and why it's not at Rogue either. The deck I had to mention, because again, this is one of those decks that if you're unprepared for, you could get locked out of the extra deck with the Amorphage monster. You can locked out of playing with the massive boards that they make, especially if you don't know how to play around it. The next deck on the list, and this is another Rogue deck, I am hesitant to put this at tier 2 because the deck still has to play a lot of bricks, and the combo itself can be pretty fragile. Its end boards are still terrifying. Able to lock your opponent out of special summoning with Christia while also being able to end Baron or the Master Hyperion Synchro with access to Hot Red King Calamity definitely makes this deck a threat, but I just wouldn't put it over other rogue decks here. And on to Infernoid. I'm going to put this at the bottom end of Rogue. And the reason I'm doing this is because every other format we see that a random Infernoid list tops, which they happen to use the control aspect of the deck with Lair of Darkness, being able to tribute your opponent's monsters, and then just have a bunch of back row behind it, which can make this deck really tough to play against. And we happen to see that happen again in the Greek Nationals, where an Infernoid deck got 12th place. So I definitely don't think it's smart to sleep on this deck. It's good enough to be rogue in my opinion. It's just massively underrepresented. The next deck is Madolches, and this is almost like a Mighty Have Fallen moment, but it's kind of not, and the reason I say it is because there was a point where this deck looked like it was trending up, because of the style of decks that kind of came out, the Adventure engine and the Punk engine and the Therion engine kind of being splashed to everything, Sword Soul being as consistent as it is, Nib being as prominent as a card. It definitely has bumped down Madolche to the mid to lower end of the rogue tier. Not to say it's a bad deck at all, but it's just not good as the decks above it, in my opinion. The next deck on the list is Predaplants, and I know that some might be calling me crazy for not putting this at tier 2. I don't want to put this at tier 2 though, just because it's a lot more fragile than I like to see. Basically, this deck can really overcommit to Nib, and on top of that, it can lose pretty hard to back row removal. It doesn't necessarily have the same levels of follow-up as a deck like Despia. Being said, I do still think that you have to put it in the rogue tier just because it can make terrifying boards. The hands feel like they play well, definitely well enough to be put in the rogue tier. That's pretty much my thoughts on that. The next deck here is True Draco, and unfortunately I have to put this at Cope also. Simply put, Diagram, Terraforming, Demise, they're all hit. Masterpieces, still banned. Might is still only at 2. We may be getting some cards back slowly, but what made this deck good before just isn't around. The next deck on the list is Sky Strikers, and Sky Strikers, there's an argument that you could put this at tier 1.5 because of its ability to play Mine and D-Barrier, all this stuff so free, but I am going to put it at tier 2 just because I do think that you have to be a good pilot in order to make this deck look like a tier 1.5 deck. A bad deck by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just one of those things where if more people prepare for this, it also gets worse. So I've seen Thunder Theory try the Sacred Beast engine and other stuff like Chaos cards with Thunder Dragons, and unfortunately without Colossus, I just don't think that this deck is prominent enough to do anything this format. Where I want to put the deck, I don't know. I'll probably put it slightly ahead of Orcus, as it can also kind of combo, make a Titan or two, unmask and whatnot, but don't think that is any good when you look at the rest of the decks this format. Next deck on the list is another deck that I'm gonna have to put at Cope, which is almost insane to say, and I think that this might be one of the best Cope decks here, and it's Guru Control. So Guru Control is one of the decks hurt the least by the Verte ban, because even if it used Dragoon, it still has the Insight, the Red Eyes fusions, still untouched, and it never went into Verte much in the first place. The issue is that you can set your 3 or 4, and even set a Guru if you get to, but the deck is just too slow. There's too much removal, there's too much counter cards for it. Have me putting it here at Cope, which is just kind of crazy to say, because as a control/stun deck, this felt like it was going to be a lot better in the days of Master Rule 4, but clearly since Master Rule 5 came along in 2020, where the exclusive link rules were basically removed and the game basically went back to normal, definitely pushed this deck down to the Cope section. Next deck on the list is Mermails, and I'm definitely putting this at Rogue. I know that it doesn't have the representation, but this is still a very powerful deck that can play through hand traps with the Deep Sea card that can snipe a card, helps it play around Nib, being able to Moulin Glacier your opponent, and then make some negates on top of that. This deck is a stronger deck than given credit for. Obviously, it's not to the level of the ones above, but it's not something to sleep on either. Next deck I'll probably get hate for putting this high is Salamangreat at 1.5, and again, I just think that the one-card starters, Circle being at 3, Signet Mining still at 3, that this trio of Cybers decks that are just able to play a bunch of hand traps and have link monsters that basically allow you to draw 1 every turn, including your opponent's turn, which draws you into the hand traps, even if they have weaknesses to Nib. Ability to play cross out and stuff. His decks very formidable in a format like this. You have Paleo, and again, I think that this is another deck that's been pushed down to the Cope section. For Paleo to do good, this needs more support that can bring part of its engine out quicker, and right now it just doesn't have that. So it can still be a very annoying deck to play against, as you still have to go through potential Floodgates, Toad, and other sets. I don't think that it's at the Rogue level, where some of these other decks are just far more explosive or better at what Paleo do. Finally, we have Libromancers, the last deck here, and I'm going to put this as Rogue as well. I don't necessarily know where I want to put this. There's different versions of it with the Scythe Lock and the one that we saw Triff using. But again, I just think it's a cute deck that works, can feel rewarding, but it's not one of those decks that you can pick up and expect to see success with immediately to the power of the cards. The last deck put into its place. Made it this far into the video. I thank you for watching. I would love to hear your opinions on the tier list down below. If I lowballed anything or put something too high, feel free to let me know. And focus was kind of just to cover as many decks as I possibly could. I hope you enjoyed. It's Bones, signing out.